Welcome to another deep dive. We are thrilled to have you joining us today. You know, we spend our entire lives walking into local coffee shops, working in high-rise office buildings, and buying goods that were meticulously stored in massive suburban warehouses.
Right.
But rarely do we ever stop to think about the invisible architecture that makes all of that possible. We look at a building and see bricks, glass, and steel. But beneath that physical surface is this labyrinth of legal and financial agreements that dictate quite literally everything that happens inside those walls.
It really is a labyrinth.
Yeah. Today, our mission is to decode that hidden, incredibly complex, and sometimes downright ruthless world of commercial and industrial real estate. We are pulling back the curtain on how physical space is legally bound.
What's fascinating here is that the concrete floors you walk on and the ceilings above your desk are governed by a web of contracts. Contracts that dictate everything from the specific air quality of your office to the exact number of parking spaces allowed outside your favorite grocery store. For this deep dive, we are pulling from some incredibly detailed industry documentation, specifically focusing on the frameworks governing agreements for industrial properties and the intricate leasing structures for office, retail, and industrial spaces. We're looking closely at the mechanics detailed in chapters 11 and 12 of the mini-cram real estate study materials.
Which are dense, very dense.
Oh, incredibly, but so important. This isn't just about how someone buys a piece of property. This is about the high-stakes, uncompromising machinery of modern business.
And whether you are an aspiring entrepreneur or dreaming of opening your very first storefront, an established business owner looking to expand your logistics into a dedicated warehouse, or you're just insanely curious about how the physical world of commerce actually operates behind the scenes, I promise you, this deep dive is going to deliver some major aha moments.
Absolutely.
We're going to explore everything from environmental landmines that can utterly bankrupt an unsuspecting buyer to the secret mathematical formulas that landlords use to legally charge you rent for space you don't even occupy.
Yeah, it is a completely different landscape compared to the residential real estate market most people are familiar with. The stakes are exponentially higher, the financial liabilities are massive, and the entire rulebook is written under the strict legal assumption that everyone involved is a sophisticated business entity.
Which means no hand-holding.
None whatsoever. There are very few consumer safety nets here. If you sign a poorly negotiated lease or purchase a property with hidden contamination, the consequences can be catastrophic for your business. The law expects you to know what you are doing.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start by looking at the absolute beast that is industrial real estate. When you look at the documentation for these transactions, it becomes immediately apparent that buying an industrial property is incredibly complex.
Without a doubt.
You're dealing with wildly varying sizes of buildings, the conflict between what the building is currently used for versus what you intend to use it for, and of course, massive heavy-duty equipment. The foundational document for all of this is the Commercial Agreement of Purchase and Sale, often referred to as Form 500.
Right. And that document is the bedrock of the entire transaction. It is far from a simple boilerplate template that you just quickly sign on the dotted line.
Definitely not.
A professional involved in these transactions has to deeply understand the highly specific operational needs of the end user. You have to ask, are they doing light service work, heavy manufacturing, high-volume warehousing?
Because it completely changes the paperwork.
Exactly. Each of those specific operations requires unique, custom-tailored due diligence clauses to be carefully inserted into that purchase agreement. You're basically building a custom legal shield for that specific business.
I found one of the biggest areas of conflict in these industrial transactions to be the distinction between chattels and fixtures. You walk into a massive manufacturing plant and you see millions of dollars worth of machinery everywhere. When you actually buy the place, there has to be a definitive line drawn regarding what stays bolted to the floor and what the seller gets to pack up and take to their next facility.
It is a critical and often heavily litigated legal distinction. Chattels are movable, personal items that belong to the seller. They're not part of the real property, and they are typically subject to sales taxes upon the sale.
Right.
Fixtures, on the other hand, refer to any items that are permanently attached or affixed to the property itself. Under the law, a fixture becomes part of the real estate. When an industrial property hits the market, the listing documentation usually provides a schedule of what chattels, fixtures, and equipment are included in the asking price.
But it gets mercy, right?
Very. In an industrial setting, distinguishing between a heavy piece of machinery and a permanent part of the building can be incredibly ambiguous.
The documentation provides this fantastic hypothetical that really clarified the danger here. Imagine a giant industrial air compressor sitting in the middle of a factory floor.
Classic example.
The compressor itself might be considered a chattel. It's a discrete piece of equipment that can technically be moved, but the heavy-duty pneumatic piping and the complex electrical wiring running through the walls that connect that compressor to the rest of the building, those lines are almost certainly considered fixtures.
And you can easily see how a massive misunderstanding could unfold on closing day.
Oh.
The buyer might be touring the facility, looking at that massive compressor unit, and thinking they're acquiring a fully functioning, integrated pneumatic system ready for their assembly line. Meanwhile, the seller is fully planning to unbolt the compressor unit, hoist it onto a flatbed truck, and take it to their new facility across town.
Leaving behind severed, useless pipes protruding from the walls.
Exactly. If this exact scenario isn't meticulously clarified in the specific clauses of the purchase agreement, the buyer basically takes possession of a crippled factory.
So how do buyers actually bulletproof that equipment transfer? Looking at the standard clauses, there is an intense focus on removing any room for assumption.
You have to.
You have to explicitly list things like heating and air conditioning units, sprinkler systems, conveyor belts, freight elevators, and even everyday office items like commercial photocopiers. One of the primary tools here is the Good Working Order clause.
Yes.
This acts as a legal warranty from the seller, ensuring that every single piece of equipment included in the sale actually functions as intended on the day of closing.
That warranty is essential because you aren't just buying the physical metal, you're buying the utility of the machine. But a smart buyer doesn't just take the seller's word for it. They pair that warranty with a rigorous inspection clause.
Trust but verify.
Exactly. This is a condition that legally permits the buyer to bring in third-party specialized professionals to conduct exhaustive inspections of all the mechanical systems. You wouldn't buy a used commercial jet without having aviation mechanics tear it down and inspect it.
Right.
You certainly shouldn't buy a commercial conveyor system or a high-capacity freight elevator without an expert verifying its structural and mechanical integrity.
And tied directly to that inspection process is the demand for maintenance records. I was reading about how crucial historical maintenance logs are for things like commercial HVAC systems or elevators. An elevator repair in a commercial building could easily cost more than a single-family residential home.
Easily.
The buyer needs a clause that legally compels the seller to hand over years of historical maintenance logs to prove that the equipment hasn't been chronically neglected.
It's basically forensic accounting for machinery. If the logs show the freight elevator has broken down 12 times in the last 6 months, the buyer now has the leverage to go back to the seller and demand a massive price reduction, or demand that the elevator be fully replaced before the deal closes.
Makes perfect sense.
Furthermore, the purchase agreement also needs to address the equipment that is specifically excluded from the sale. Often, buyers will utilize a clause that gives them the right of first refusal or a specific time frame to negotiate purchasing additional equipment. Things like modular office furniture or specialized racking systems that the seller originally intended to take with them.
What happens when the seller does take their heavy machinery? If they are hauling a 10-ton hydraulic press out of the facility, the potential for collateral damage to the building has to be enormous.
Which is exactly why you need a highly specific removal of equipment clause. This stipulation dictates that not only must the seller remove their excluded equipment at their own sole expense before closing, but more importantly, they are legally and financially liable for repairing any damage caused to the property during that extraction process.
Because dragging a massive press across a warehouse can gouge the concrete floor, damage the loading dock, or even compromise structural support columns.
Exactly. And the buyer cannot inherit the cost of that damage. There are even clauses just to ensure the seller leaves the existing lighting fixtures behind and in working order, so the buyer doesn't walk into a pitch-black, stripped warehouse on day one.
It really is an exercise in eliminating all assumptions. But getting the building and the equipment intact is only half the battle. We have to talk about the concept of present use versus intended use.
The zoning trap.
Yes. Just because a massive, beautiful industrial building exists doesn't mean you can just buy it and run whatever business you want inside of it. The municipality has the ultimate say.
Municipal zoning bylaws dictate the economic reality of the property. While the standard purchase agreement doesn't legally require you to fill in the present use of the building, often you will just see a broad term like warehousing inserted into the title search clause. The municipality does not hand you a guarantee that your specific, highly nuanced business plan actually complies with their strict zoning matrix.
Right.
The burden of due diligence falls entirely on the buyer and their legal team to verify that their intended use is legally permitted.
Let's create a hypothetical scenario here. Imagine I'm a buyer and I purchase a massive distribution warehouse. My specific business model requires me to build out 20% of that cavernous warehouse space into high-end corporate offices for my sales team. But during my due diligence, I discover the current municipal zoning only allows a maximum of 10% of the floor plan to be used for administrative office space. I am suddenly trapped. My business model is illegal in that building.
In that scenario, you need conditional clauses to buy yourself time and options. You would insert a condition allowing you to apply to the local municipality for a minor variance.
Minor variance.
Right. This is essentially a formal request for a slight, localized exception to the rigid zoning rules.
Sure.
You're asking permission to build that 20% office space instead of the standard 10%, arguing that it doesn't fundamentally change the nature of the industrial park.
Okay, so you just asked nicely.
Basically. And the purchase agreement remains conditional until the municipality grants that variance. If they deny it, you can walk away from the deal and get your deposit back.
But what if my plan is way more ambitious? What if I want to buy an old, heavy manufacturing plant and completely gut it to create a massive, multi-level indoor entertainment and sports complex? A minor variance isn't going to cover a fundamental change in the nature of the property.
For a total paradigm shift like that, you require a full rezoning clause. This represents a major structural change in the permitted use, and it is a massive, expensive, and time-consuming municipal process.
I can imagine.
What is incredibly important to structure in the purchase agreement is the division of labor and financial responsibility during this conditional period. Typically, the buyer is the one driving the project, so the buyer pays for all the associated costs, hiring the urban planners, the architects, the traffic engineers, and paying the steep municipal application fees.
But the buyer doesn't own the building yet.
Exactly. Because the deal hasn't closed yet, the seller is still the legal owner of the property. Therefore, the agreement must legally bind the seller to cooperate, forcing them to sign and execute all the necessary municipal applications on behalf of the buyer's vision.
That requires an incredible amount of cooperation and trust. If the seller gets cold feet and drags their feet on signing those municipal applications, the buyer's entire multi-million-dollar redevelopment project stalls out before it even begins.
Which is why the legal wording of that cooperation clause must be ironclad.
You mentioned zoning as a major hurdle, but looking deeply into this documentation, it seems like the actual dirt underneath the building is infinitely more dangerous than the zoning laws. The literature explicitly warns that failing to investigate environmental issues can be utterly disastrous for a commercial buyer.
Calling it disastrous is almost an understatement. When you deal with manufacturing, chemical processing, or any heavy industrial activity, you are inherently dealing with the storage, handling, use, and disposal of hazardous materials and industrial wastes.
Nasty stuff.
Very. We're talking about operations that might have been running for 50 or 60 years. If harmful raw materials, toxic solvents, or heavy oils were improperly stored or casually dumped out back in the 1970s, those toxins might be silently migrating through the soil or poisoning the local groundwater right at this very moment.
And the government doesn't care who spilled it, right?
Under strict environmental protection laws, the current owner of the property is very often the entity left holding the bag for the astronomical cleanup costs, regardless of whether they were the ones who actually caused the original spill. You buy the land, you buy the liability.
That is a terrifying prospect for a buyer. To protect themselves from inheriting a multi-million-dollar government-mandated cleanup bill, they have to rely on a highly structured environmental due diligence process. The industry breaks this down into 3 distinct phases of environmental site assessment. Let's walk through these, because this is where the real historical detective work happens.
The environmental site assessment is your primary shield against inheriting ruin. Phase 1 is the preliminary, non-invasive investigation.
Non-invasive meaning no digging yet.
Correct. It involves a thorough visual inspection of the property's current state, but the real value is the deep dive into the historical documentation. Environmental professionals will pull decades of registry information, chain of title records, fire insurance plans, and municipal archives to reconstruct the entire operational history of that specific plot of land.
They're looking for red flags.
Precisely. Was this site a high-volume dry cleaner in the 1980s? Was there an independent gas station operating here in the 1950s? Because the potential costs of remediation are so high, almost all commercial mortgage lenders will absolutely require a clean Phase 1 report before they will even consider approving the financing for an industrial property.
I'm looking at this liability stuff, and it makes total sense why a bank wouldn't want to lend money on a toxic asset. The property itself is the collateral for the loan. If the property is worthless because it's a toxic hazard, the bank's security is gone.
Exactly.
So if that Phase 1 historical search uncovers a red flag, say, the archives show there used to be a massive underground chemical storage tank 50 years ago, what is the next move?
The Phase 1 report will recommend escalating to a Phase 2 assessment. This is the physical, scientific testing phase.
This is the digging.
This is the digging. The buyer hires environmental engineers who bring in heavy equipment to drill boreholes, take core samples of the deep soil, install monitoring wells to test the groundwater, and send all of those samples to a laboratory to analyze for specific hazardous compounds.
And the goal there?
The goal here is to determine if contamination actually exists, map the exact subterranean scope of that contamination, and provide the buyer with specific engineered recommendations for how to clean it up.
And if that Phase 2 laboratory report comes back positive and you have a confirmed toxic plume slowly moving under the warehouse?
That triggers Phase 3, which is the actual physical remediation of the site. This involves executing the cleanup plan, which could mean excavating thousands of tons of contaminated soil and hauling it to a specialized treatment facility, or installing complex filtration systems to pump and treat the groundwater for years.
That sounds incredibly expensive.
It is. Phase 3 also involves calculating the massive financial costs associated with that cleanup, which becomes a central point of negotiation if the buyer still wants to proceed with the purchase.
Speaking of massive cleanup costs, it's amazing how much of commercial environmental liability comes down to one highly specific hazard: underground oil tanks. The documentation focuses so heavily on this. A rusting, forgotten tank of heating oil buried beneath the property decades ago is basically a ticking environmental time bomb.
They're a notorious and pervasive liability. Heating oil tanks were incredibly common, and they have a finite structural lifespan. When a steel tank buried in damp soil eventually corrodes and leaks, thousands of gallons of heavy fuel oil seep directly into the surrounding soil and groundwater. It creates an immediate and severe environmental crisis.
Wow.
Therefore, if a property currently has or historically had an underground fuel oil tank, the purchase agreement requires incredibly specific, highly negotiated clauses to manage and transfer that risk.
The legal frameworks provide 4 distinct avenues for handling these tanks. Let's say the property currently relies on an underground tank for its heating system and the buyer intends to keep using it. They would use the existing oil tank clause. This is a condition that demands assurance that the tank and its operational components currently meet all modern safety and environmental standards.
To verify that assurance, a licensed fuel oil distributor, one registered under the governing authorities like the Technical Standards and Safety Act, is brought in to conduct a comprehensive inspection of the tank's integrity before the deal closes.
But what if you want something stronger?
If the buyer wants an even stronger legal guarantee, they escalate to the compliance warranty for underground oil tank. This isn't just an inspection. It's a formal, legally binding representation and warranty from the seller, guaranteeing that the tank complies with all technical standards.
So they have to prove it.
The seller is required to provide the official registration numbers and compliance documents directly to the buyer. If the tank leaks the day after closing, and it turns out it wasn't actually compliant, the buyer has a powerful legal basis to sue the seller for breach of warranty.
But what if the seller tells the buyer, hey, don't worry, there used to be a tank, but we dug it up and threw it away 5 years ago? A buyer can't just take the seller's word that they yanked it out with a buddy's backhoe over the weekend.
Absolutely not.
They need the previously removed underground oil tank clause. This forces the seller to provide documented proof that a licensed, certified contractor performed the removal, and crucially, that they tested the soil and remediated any contamination that might have existed in the pit before they filled it back in with dirt.
That documented proof of clean soil is the entire point of the clause. And the final, and perhaps most aggressive avenue, is the seller to remove underground oil tank clause.
Oh, I like the sound of that one.
If the buyer discovers an old tank during due diligence and wants absolutely nothing to do with it, they use this clause to force the seller to hire a certified contractor to carefully excavate and entirely remove the tank before the closing date.
Get it out of here.
Exactly. Furthermore, the clause dictates that the seller must provide laboratory evidence that the underlying soil is clean, and they must financially cover the cost of restoring the grading and landscaping, so the buyer isn't left with a massive muddy crater in their new parking lot.
These clauses are absolute lifesavers. But it makes me wonder about the vulnerable period between removing all the contingencies and the actual closing day. What happens if disaster strikes right before you get the keys?
Pre-closing disaster.
Yeah. Let's say you've signed the agreement, the environmental test came back clean, you are 2 weeks away from closing, and the seller accidentally smashes a forklift through a load-bearing wall while moving their equipment out.
The standard commercial purchase agreement anticipates these pre-closing disasters. For the scenario you just described, the pre-printed insurance clauses dictate that the property remains at the risk of the seller until the closing occurs.
So the seller pays.
The seller's insurance policies must remain active and must cover the cost of those repairs. A diligent buyer's legal team will always verify that the seller actually maintains adequate commercial insurance coverage throughout the closing period.
But what about something truly catastrophic? What if an electrical fire burns half the warehouse to the ground 10 days before closing?
A fire that guts the facility forces the buyer to make a monumental decision. The buyer has the legal right to simply terminate the agreement, take their deposit back, and walk away from the ashes.
Just walk away.
But if the buyer still deeply desires that specific property, perhaps the location is irreplaceable for their logistics network, or the land value itself is the main draw, they have the option to close the deal anyway.
Really? By a burnt-down building?
Yes, but in this scenario, they can negotiate to legally inherit the proceeds of the seller's fire insurance payout, essentially taking the insurance money to rebuild the warehouse themselves to their own modern specifications.
Okay, that makes sense. And what if that phase 2 environmental testing we talked about doesn't cause a fire, but instead reveals a massive hidden plume of soil contamination right before closing? The buyer doesn't just automatically lose their deposit if they want to back out, right?
No, the conditional clauses protect the deposit. If contamination is found, the parties have several options to resolve the completion issue. They can negotiate an amendment for an extension of completion date.
Buy some time.
Right. If the buyer needs an extra 60 days to bring in more engineers to truly understand the scope of the toxic plume, or the seller agrees to clean it up and needs time to do the excavation, they just push the closing date back.
What's the other option?
Alternatively, they can negotiate financial compensation. The buyer might say, look, our engineers estimate it will cost $500,000 to remediate this soil. We will still close on time, and we will take on the liability, but you are reducing the final purchase price of the property by $500,000 right now.
It really highlights why navigating commercial real estate requires an entire army of specialized professionals. You have environmental engineers testing the soil, structural inspectors checking the roof, forensic accountants reviewing the operating expenses, commercial bankers structuring the massive debt, and a brilliant legal team tying all of these specialized clauses together. The complexity is staggering.
It is a multidisciplinary effort. A single oversight in any of those domains can result in millions of dollars in unexpected liabilities.
All right, let's shift gears entirely and move into the leasing lexicon. We are transitioning our focus to the frameworks governing commercial leases. For anyone who's only experienced with renting as a standard residential apartment lease, the commercial leasing world is going to look like a completely alien and frankly terrifying landscape. The power dynamics are totally different.
In a residential setting, the law heavily protects the tenant, often viewing them as the vulnerable party in need of consumer protection. In commercial leasing, the law assumes two sophisticated business entities are entering into a negotiation of equals. Right. A commercial lease is fundamentally a contract where the landlord grants the tenant the right to occupy and use a specific premises for their business operations for a clearly defined term in exchange for rent. While every large commercial complex or office tower has a standard lease template, that document is merely the opening salvo.
Just the starting point.
Unlike a rigid, heavily regulated residential lease, a commercial standard lease is deeply and aggressively modified through negotiation to suit the highly specific operational and financial requirements of the tenant and the risk tolerance of the landlord.
It's a blank canvas for negotiation. And the biggest shock for a new business owner transitioning into commercial space is understanding how the rent is actually structured. It's not just writing one check a month. There is an entire escalation of financial responsibility that I like to call the net lease ladder.
The net lease ladder, I like that.
Let's start at the very bottom with the gross lease. In a gross lease, the tenant pays one single fixed amount of rent every month. The landlord takes that single payment and uses it to cover all the underlying expenses of the property, the municipal property taxes, the building insurance, and all the maintenance costs.
From a tenant's perspective, a gross lease is highly desirable. It provides absolute financial security and predictable overhead. You know exactly what your occupancy costs will be every single month, making financial forecasting very simple.
But landlords hate them.
Landlords generally despise gross leases, and they are increasingly rare in modern commercial real estate.
Because of the risk.
Exactly. Why? Because under a gross lease, the landlord is entirely absorbing the risk of inflation and unpredictable operational cost spikes. If the municipality decides to aggressively reassess the building and doubles the property taxes, or a severe winter requires $50,000 in unexpected snow plowing and roof maintenance, all of those extra costs eat directly into the landlord's profit margin. The tenant's rent stays the same, but the landlord makes less money.
So, to protect their profit margins, landlords actively push tenants up the ladder into what are known as net leases. In a net lease structure, the tenant is required to pay a base minimum rent for the space itself, plus an additional variable rent to cover their proportionate share of the building's operating expenses.
Right.
And there are levels of severity to this. Level 1 is the single net lease. The tenant pays their base rent, plus they take on the responsibility of paying the property taxes. The landlord still covers maintenance and insurance.
Okay, level one.
Level 2 is the double net lease. The tenant pays base rent, plus property taxes, plus the building insurance premiums, but the landlord is still generally on the hook for major structural property maintenance.
Which naturally brings us to the apex of the ladder and the ultimate favorite of commercial landlords everywhere, the triple net lease.
The triple.
In a triple net lease, the tenant pays the base minimum rent, plus literally everything else associated with the operation and ownership of that property. The tenant pays the property taxes, the building insurance, all routine maintenance, all utility costs, and crucially, they're often responsible for major structural repairs.
Meaning, if the roof caves in.
If the HVAC system completely fails, or the roof collapses under heavy snow, the tenant pays to replace it. Under a pure triple net structure, the landlord essentially transforms into a purely passive financial entity, collecting a guaranteed risk-free profit check every month, while the tenant bears 100% of the operational and structural risks of the physical building.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The concept of the retail partnership, officially known as the percentage lease. When I first learned about this mechanism, it completely changed how I view the economy of a shopping mall.
It's brilliant.
In this structure, the tenant pays a negotiated base monthly rent plus their share of operating costs, PLUS, a percentage of their actual gross monthly sales over a certain baseline.
It fundamentally alters the traditional landlord-tenant dynamic. It aligns their financial incentives, essentially turning the landlord into a de facto silent partner in the tenant's retail business.
They're in it together.
The landlord secures their downside risk by guaranteeing they receive at least the base minimum rent to cover their debt service. But they get to actively share in the financial upside and revenue growth if the tenant's business thrives in that specific location.
Let's actually walk through the math on this, because seeing the numbers really illustrates the genius of the system. Imagine you are a retail tenant and you negotiate a lease for a 2,000 square foot boutique store in a busy shopping center.
Okay.
Your agreed upon base minimum rent is $30 per square foot per year. So 2,000 square feet multiplied by $30 equals $60,000. That $60,000 is your absolute base minimum rent for the year, regardless of whether you sell one item or a million items.
Correct. That is the landlord's guaranteed floor. But your lease also contains a percentage rent clause, stipulating that you must pay 5% of your gross sales that exceed a specific negotiated baseline. Now, let's say your boutique has a phenomenal year, and your total gross sales hit $1,450,000.
Okay, so to figure out how much extra percentage rent I owe the landlord, I don't just hand over 5% of my total $1.45 million in sales, right? That would be ruinous.
No, the percentage is only applied to the sales volume that triggers the clause, the amount above the established breakpoint. In the typical industry example, the math works like this. You determine the sales volume subject to the percentage. which in this hypothetical, let's say, is calculated at $1,350,000.
Got it.
You multiply that $1,350,000 by your negotiated 5% rate, which equals $67,500.
Right. So the total rent obligation based on the success of the business is $67,500. But the tenant has already committed to paying and has been paying the $60,000 base minimum rent throughout the year.
Exactly. So to find the actual additional percentage rent owed to the landlord at the end of the reconciliation period, you subtract the base minimum rent from that total percentage calculation. You take the $67,500, subtract the $60,000 base rent you already owe, and the difference is $7,500.
So on top of all the base rent and operating costs, the tenant has to write the landlord a bonus check for $7,500 simply because the store had a great year.
A literal bonus check.
This dynamic explains why commercial landlords demand strict audit rights and force retail tenants to regularly report their monthly gross sales figures. They use these ongoing figures to collect interim payments of percentage rent instead of waiting until the end of the year.
And it gives them data.
Yes. More strategically, it allows the landlord to forensically monitor the financial health of every single tenant in their mall. If a store's sales begin to slide, the landlord knows instantly, months before the tenant actually defaults on their base rent.
There is one more unique, highly specialized type of lease structure we need to mention. The retail ground lease, frequently referred to in the industry as a land lease or a pad lease. In this fascinating scenario, the landlord isn't leasing a building at all. They're literally only leasing the raw dirt.
Just dirt?
The tenant signs the lease, brings in their own construction crews, and builds their own custom, standalone building entirely at their own expense on the landlord's land.
Why on earth would a tenant spend millions of dollars to construct a building on a piece of land they don't even own? That sounds like a terrible investment.
It's a highly strategic, long-term capital play, typically utilized by massive national chains. Think of a standalone fast food franchise or a large retail bank branch. These leases are usually signed for initial terms of 10 to 20 years, often with multiple renewal options.
So they're in it for the long haul.
Exactly. For the tenant, the benefit is capital efficiency. They get to operate a highly customized, brand-specific building in a prime, high-traffic commercial location. But they dramatically lower their upfront capital costs because they aren't forced to purchase the wildly expensive commercial real estate underneath it. They deploy their capital into their business operations, not into holding land.
And for the landlord.
For the landlord, it is an incredibly lucrative, low-effort arrangement. They collect steady, guaranteed ground rent for 20 years with zero building maintenance responsibilities. And the kicker. At the end of the lease term, unless negotiated otherwise, the land legally reverts back to the landlord's total control. But now it has a fully constructed, valuable commercial building sitting on it, massively improving the overall value of the landlord's portfolio.
That is a wild transfer of wealth at the end.
It is. The major vulnerability for the tenant is that if their business booms and they want to physically expand the footprint of the building 5 years later, they were entirely at the mercy of the landlord's approval to alter the site plan.
It requires a totally different philosophy regarding asset ownership and capital deployment. Okay, let's dive into the anatomy of a lease and the sometimes brutal rules of commercial tenancy. When you look at the actual paperwork, a commercial lease must contain several mandatory, highly specific clauses to even be considered a legally enforceable document in court.
The foundational requirements begin with the precise legal identification of the parties involved. There must be a minimum of 2 legally distinct signatories. Following that is the description of the premises. This must be painstakingly specific.
How specific?
If a tenant is leasing a single-purpose, standalone industrial property, the lease will simply define the entire building and the surrounding parking lot as the leased premises. However, if the tenant is moving into a complex with multiple buildings sharing a common parking lot and shared loading zones, the lease must identify the specific unit using municipal addresses, legal descriptions, and crucially, it must reference an attached, highly detailed architectural site plan to define the exact boundaries of the tenant's domain.
Then you have the permitted use clause, which I find fascinating because it dictates exactly what type of business operations you are legally allowed to conduct within that specific space.
Very strict.
The documentation emphasizes that for most tenants, this clause should be simple, clear, precise, and highly limited in scope. For example, in a massive shopping mall, the landlord is carefully curating a specific mix of businesses. The massive anchor tenants, The huge department stores that take up multiple floors wield so much power that they might demand an incredibly broad permitted use clause, allowing them to sell everything from high-end electronics to groceries.
Right, they can do whatever they want.
But a smaller satellite tenant will be bound by a very strict permitted use clause. If you sign a lease to operate a high-end shoe store and 2 years later you realize shoes aren't selling, but gourmet hot dogs are a massive trend, you cannot just suddenly pivot and start cooking hot dogs in your retail space.
Wow, absolutely not.
If it violates the permitted use clause, the landlord can instantly terminate your lease for default.
The document also absolutely requires clear commencement and expiry dates. If either the start date or the end date is missing or ambiguous, the contract may fail to meet the legal definition of a lease, rendering it unenforceable. Interestingly, legal precedent has shown that if a contract grants possession of a property but lacks a defined expiry date, a court might interpret that document not as a temporary lease, but as an actual permanent sale of the real property.
Wow. A simple clerical omission regarding an end date could accidentally transfer ownership of a multi-million-dollar asset.
It's happened.
And when it comes time to renew that term, assuming the lease has renewal options built in, the rent for the new term isn't usually just a shot in the dark. It is frequently negotiated based on predetermined formulas, often tied to the percentage change in the Consumer Price Index, or CPI.
Right, tying it to CPI.
This mechanism automatically protects the landlord's revenue stream against the eroding effects of inflation over a long-term 10-year lease. Now, let's talk about the rent-free period. Landlords will frequently entice new commercial tenants by offering them a few months of rent-free time at the beginning of the lease to allow them to renovate the space, install their fixtures, and stock their shelves before they officially open for business. But there is a massive caveat here. Rent-free does not mean cost-free.
That is a crucial distinction that catches many new business owners off guard. During a negotiated rent-free period, the tenant is formally excused from paying the base minimum rent. However, they are absolutely still legally responsible for paying all of the utility costs they consume during construction.
So they're paying the electric bill.
Exactly. And they are usually responsible for paying their proportionate share of the building's operating expenses, commonly known as TMI taxes, maintenance, and insurance. The landlord is willing to forego their profit for a few months to secure a good tenant, but they're absolutely not going to personally subsidize the electricity and property taxes while your construction crew builds out your new showroom.
I want to spend some time on a legal concept that sounds incredibly dry and academic, but the real-world implications are absolutely terrifying for small business owners. We need to talk about assignment versus subletting and the underlying legal doctrine of privity.
Crizity.
Let's frame this with a scenario. I start a business, I sign a 10-year commercial lease, and 5 years in, I decide I want to retire. I sell my business to a new operator, and I want to transfer my lease to them. What exactly is privity, and why should I be losing sleep over it?
Privity is the fundamental legal concept that determines who is bound by the rights and obligations of a contract, and consequently, who can sue or be sued under that contract. The doctrine states that only the actual parties who agree to the contract share privity.
Okay, so me and the landlord.
Right. In commercial real estate, tenants are almost universally prohibited from assigning their lease or subletting their space without the explicit written consent of the landlord. Now let's look at your scenario of selling your business through an assignment of lease.
Okay.
In an assignment, the original tenant, the assignor, transfers their entire remaining interest in the lease over to the new business owner, the assignee. The new tenant moves in and assumes the legal obligation to pay rent directly to the landlord.
Sounds simple enough.
It does. However, unless the landlord specifically and formally grants a legal release to the original tenant maintains privity of contract with the landlord for the entire remaining duration of the lease.
Wait, slow down. Does that mean if I sell my business, hand over the keys, and move to a beach to retire, I am still legally chained to that commercial property?
Yes. If the new owner takes over, runs the business into the ground 3 years later, and defaults on the rent, the landlord doesn't just sue the new failing business. Because you never severed the privity of contract, the landlord has the absolute legal right to come out of the woodwork, track you down on your beach, and sue you personally for the unpaid rent of a business you haven't owned in years.
That is horrifying. You're essentially acting as a permanent, involuntary financial guarantor for a stranger's business acumen. How does that terrifying dynamic differ from subletting?
In a sublease scenario, the original tenant doesn't transfer the whole lease. They essentially become a mini landlord themselves, renting out a portion or all of the space to a subtenant for a period shorter than the main lease term.
So I become the landlord to the new guy.
Exactly. In this structure, there is absolutely no privity of contract between the master landlord and the new subtenant. The master landlord cannot directly sue or pursue the subtenant for unpaid rent or lease violations. The landlord can only pursue the original tenant, the one they share privity with.
And then I have to go after the subtenant.
Yes, the original tenant must then, in turn, pursue their subtenant. Because landlords hate lacking direct legal recourse against the people actually occupying their building, they will almost always include a specific provision requiring the subtenant to sign a direct covenant with the landlord. This legally creates privity between all parties, ensuring the landlord can cast a wide legal net and sue anyone involved if things go south.
Speaking of things going south, the rules governing what happens when a commercial tenant fails to pay rent are shockingly aggressive. If you look at residential tenancy laws, evicting a non-paying tenant is a grueling process.
It takes months.
I remember renting an apartment in my 20s, and if I had stopped paying rent, it probably would have taken my landlord 6 months of notices, tribunal hearings, and appeals before they could actually remove me. The legal system is designed to prevent people from becoming instantly homeless. But what happens in the commercial arena under the Commercial Tenancies Act?
The commercial arena is swift, severe, and highly protective of the landlord's revenue stream. The Commercial Tenancies Act outlines the fundamental rights and obligations of both parties, but when it comes to the non-payment of rent, the default statutory remedies are incredibly powerful.
How fast are we talking?
Under the Act, if a commercial tenant fails to pay their rent, the landlord does not need to wait months for a tribunal hearing. On the 16th day after the rent was officially due and remained unpaid, the landlord has the legal right to simply arrive at the property, change the physical locks, and instantly evict the tenant, entirely without providing any prior written notice.
The 16th day. That is barely 2 weeks. You could have a bad month of sales, miss your rent payment, and arrive at your business on a Tuesday morning to find your keys don't work and your entire livelihood is locked behind glass.
It happens all the time.
The suddenness of that is breathtaking. The only slight mercy is that the landlord must eventually allow the tenant access to remove their own personal property and inventory, but the business operations are effectively instantly terminated.
It is a ruthless mechanism designed to immediately halt the landlord's financial bleeding. Furthermore, the commercial landscape is truly a free market. The Commercial Tenancies Act does not regulate or cap rent increases at the end of a lease term. Nor does it require commercial landlords to pay interest on a tenant security deposit unless it is specifically negotiated and written into the lease agreement.
So where do you go if you disagree?
If disputes arise regarding things like property damages, disrupted business revenue, or disputed operating expenses, there is no specialized tenant board to hear the case. The parties must battle it out in the traditional civil court system. For smaller disputes, they rely on small claims court, which, as of January 2020, has a maximum claim limit of $35,000.
And for bigger claims?
For anything larger, which most commercial real estate disputes are, they are headed for expensive, protracted litigation in the Superior Court of Justice.
It really emphasizes the reality that when you sign a commercial lease, you're playing in the big leagues without a safety net. Let's transition to look at how these spaces are actually tailored for specific industries. The physical requirements and the lease clauses vary wildly depending on whether you are looking at office, retail, or industrial space. Let's start with the nuances of office leasing customizations.
Okay, let's look at office.
When a tech company or a law firm rents a new floor in a downtown high-rise, it is rarely ready for them to just move their desks in. You have a massive phase called the tenant fit-up, which is the complex process of customizing the raw space.
The fit-up is where the tenant's corporate identity meets the landlord's structural limitations. Depending on the era and the culture of the company, you might see requests for massive, collaborative, open-concept designs. Or, conversely, a demand for dozens of heavily partitioned, soundproofed individual walled offices.
And the landlord cares because of the building systems.
Right. Because these renovations impact the building's HVAC flow, fire safety systems, and structural loads, the landlord will include dense lease clauses detailing exactly what architectural changes are permitted, who owns the improvements once they are built, and whether the tenant is legally required to spend thousands of dollars to demolish all of those custom offices and return the space to a base building condition at the end of the lease.
Another massive trend dictating office leases right now is LEED certification. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It is the global standard for promoting healthy, highly efficient, and cost-saving green buildings. For major corporate tenants, securing space in a LEED-certified building is a huge priority.
It's basically a requirement for some of them.
It enhances their public corporate image regarding sustainability. It improves employee relations by providing superior air quality and a natural light, and it drastically reduces their monthly utility consumption for heating, cooling, and water.
But speaking of utility consumption, the documentation highlights a surprisingly contentious issue inherent in many older office buildings: the problem of shared meters.
Oh, this is a mess.
Imagine a mid-century office complex that was built with only one massive central electricity meter monitoring the entire building's power consumption. When the massive utility bill arrives every month, how does the landlord fairly divide that cost among 20 different commercial tenants?
It seems like a mathematical nightmare that is guaranteed to cause resentment.
It absolutely is. If there's only one shared master meter, the total utility charges must be divided up and billed back to the tenants as additional rent. Landlords might attempt to estimate these charges based on an aggressive audit of the specific office equipment each tenant has plugged in and the number of hours they operate each week.
Which sounds exhausting.
Or they might take the easy route and simply divide the massive bill based on each tenant's proportionate share of the building's total square footage. But this square footage method leads to massive inherent inequalities.
Because some use more power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine a specialized software development company that runs dozens of high-powered server racks and massive cooling units 24/7. Now imagine they share a floor with a quiet, appointment-only physical therapy clinic of the exact same square footage. Under a proportionate share model, the therapy clinic is massively subsidizing the tech company's massive server farm.
That's incredibly unfair.
The only true equitable solution, which often becomes a major point of lease negotiation, is for the landlord or the tenant to absorb the significant capital cost of installing internal submeters for every single unit, ensuring everyone pays only for the exact electrons they consume.
Another critical modernization factor for office spaces is accessibility compliance, specifically adhering to the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. New office construction mandates these inclusive features legally from day one, but for older, heritage office buildings, the dynamic shifts.
Right, retrofitting.
If a tenant wants to lease an older space and execute extensive renovations, that construction often triggers a legal requirement to bring the entire suite into modern compliance with the Ontario Building Code regarding accessibility. The literature points out an interesting economic reality here. While upgrading features like installing exterior ramps, widening interior hallways, and modernizing elevators to accommodate mobility devices adds a significant upfront financial burden to the landlord or the tenant, it ultimately transforms the asset.
It's an investment.
It significantly distinguishes the building in the competitive real estate market, allowing the landlord to attract a much wider, more premium range of corporate employers and clients who demand accessible facilities.
Now let's contrast the relatively controlled office environment with the absolute chaos of retail dynamics. Retail real estate is an entirely different, highly aggressive ecosystem that is fundamentally dependent on consumer psychology, visual branding, and sheer foot traffic.
A totally different beast.
The entire financial model of a modern shopping center is built around the symbiotic yet highly unequal relationship between anchor tenants and satellite stores.
Right. Think of the layout of your local indoor shopping mall. The anchor tenant is that massive multi-level national department store or the massive grocery chain situated at the very end of the main concourse. They occupy a staggering proportion of the mall's total leasable area.
Massive footprint.
Because their brand name alone is powerful enough to draw thousands of consumers to the property every single day, the landlords treat them like royalty. They receive incredibly favorable leasing terms. They secure ultra-long-term leases to guarantee stability. And crucially, they pay a significantly, sometimes shockingly, lower base rent per square foot compared to the small, independent, boutique satellite businesses operating in the hallways between them.
The satellites pay a premium.
Those smaller stores are paying a massive premium because they are entirely reliant on capturing the overflow foot traffic generated by the gravitational pull of that anchor tenant.
The anchor tenant understands their value to the ecosystem, and they leverage it to command immense negotiating power over the landlord. They will routinely demand exclusive rights clauses in their leases.
To block competitors.
Yes. An exclusive use clause is a restrictive covenant that legally bars the landlord from leasing any other space within that entire commercial complex to a direct competitor. For example, if a major national bank agrees to anchor a new commercial plaza, they will demand a strict, non-permitted use clause stating that the landlord cannot, under any circumstances, lease space in that plaza to another financial institution or credit union. They use their leverage to legally establish a localized monopoly.
And while the anchor tenants exert control over the landlord exercises their own intense control over the smaller tenants through hours of operation clauses. Remember earlier when we broke down the math of percentage rent where the landlord gets a direct cut of the tenant's gross sales?
Right, the partnership.
Because the landlord is financially incentivized by the tenant's revenue, the landlord wants those stores open, brightly lit, and selling merchandise for as many hours as humanly possible. The commercial lease can literally dictate the specific hours and days a business must remain open.
The landlord dictates your schedule.
A landlord can legally force a small boutique owner to extend their staffing hours and stay open late into the evening during peak festive holiday seasons, specifically to drive up that gross sales volume, which directly enriches the landlord through higher percentage rent checks. If the exhausted store owner decides to close early on a slow Tuesday, they are in technical default of their lease.
The control extends beyond the front door as well. Retail leases contain incredibly specific logistical clauses regarding parking and stock delivery. A thriving retail center requires frictionless logistics. The lease must dictate specific parking ratios, mandating exactly how many parking spaces must be available per 1,000 square feet of rentable retail area, and clarify whether parking is free for consumers or monetized by the landlord.
And deliveries are strictly timed.
Furthermore, it strictly dictates the time windows and specific physical locations for inventory delivery trucks. A landlord will severely penalize a tenant if their massive 18-wheel delivery truck is idling and blocking premium customer parking spaces during peak Saturday afternoon shopping hours.
Okay, we've covered the corporate demands of office space and the consumer psychology of retail. Now let's pivot to the sheer physical brutality of industrial heavy lifting. If office space is about green certification and retail is about foot traffic, industrial real estate is fundamentally about sheer physical capacity and structural endurance. I was marveling at the intense physical requirements detailed in the industrial leasing chapters. Let's talk about the floors. In residential real estate, a concrete floor is just a concrete floor. In industrial real estate, it is a highly engineered structural component.
An industrial tenant operating heavy manufacturing equipment or high-density storage must know, mathematically, exactly what weight the facility's floor can safely support before it cracks or collapses.
Live load versus dead load.
The engineering documentation differentiates between two critical metrics, live load and dead load. Live load is the variable shifting weight. The human workers, the moving heavy equipment like loaded forklifts, and the massive fluctuating weight of the stored materials or inventory.
And dead load.
Dead load refers to the permanent, inescapable structural weight of the building's own physical components. The concrete walls, the steel roof trusses, the massive support columns. The floor slab must be structurally engineered to safely support the combined maximum of both the dead load and the peak live load simultaneously without risking catastrophic structural failure.
The infrastructure demands don't stop at the floor. The electrical requirements for an industrial tenant are massive. A tenant running a highly automated assembly line cannot simply plug in. They must mathematically verify that their heavy machinery's peak electrical draw does not exceed the permitted limits of the building's maximum cumulative power consumption. If they blow the main transformers, the entire facility shuts down.
It's a disaster.
Then there is the fascinating world of sprinkler density. I always assumed a fire sprinkler was just a standard fixture. But the fire suppression system in a massive warehouse is not one size fits all. Fire engineers use complex variables to determine the specific volume of water that must be released in a given period over a certain square footage, entirely based on the specific combustible nature of the goods being stored. A logistics company storing massive rolls of highly flammable paper requires a drastically higher, much more aggressive sprinkler density than a company storing pallets of steel auto parts.
Physical spatial dimensions are equally critical to an industrial operation's viability. You have the metric of clear height, sometimes called ceiling height. This isn't just the distance to the roof. It is the absolute, unobstructed vertical distance from the finished floor to the lowest hanging obstacle, usually a roof truss, a massive HVAC duct, or the sprinkler pipes themselves.
Because they stack things so high.
Modern logistics companies utilize massive automated racking systems. So they demand clear heights ranging from 24 feet up to 36 feet or more to maximize their vertical storage volume. Then there is the horizontal metric of bay size or bay depth.
Bay depth.
This refers to the clear distance between the massive structural steel support columns holding up the roof. An industrial tenant meticulously maps their factory floor. They need to know precisely if their 100-foot continuous assembly line or their automated robotic retrieval system will physically fit between those immovable columns without interruption.
And we absolutely cannot forget the lifeblood of industrial logistics, the loading docks. Industrial tenants live and die by the speed and efficiency of their loading and unloading operations. The lease will specifically dictate the logistical capabilities of the space. Does it only have grade-level loading, which are essentially massive garage doors where a smaller delivery truck can just drive straight off the street into the warehouse?
Or dock levelers.
Or does it feature specialized, elevated loading docks equipped with heavy-duty dock levelers, which are absolutely mandatory to properly service and unload massive 18-wheel transport trucks?
Finally, returning to the ever-present threat of environmental liability, industrial leases heavily regulate and monitor environmental issues throughout the term of the tenancy. If an industrial tenant's daily operations produce exhaust smoke, noxious chemical odors, or generate hazardous waste, strict provincial regulations from authorities like the Ministry of the Environment regulate that nuisance.
Which again falls back on the landlord.
Because the landlord understands that they could ultimately be held legally and financially liable for massive cleanup costs if the tenant causes a toxic spill and goes bankrupt. A sophisticated commercial landlord will utilize a brilliant defensive strategy.
The baseline assessment.
They will legally demand and conduct a comprehensive baseline environmental site assessment before the lease even starts, meticulously documenting the exact, pristine condition of the property's soil and groundwater. Then, the lease mandates that the tenant must pay for a second, identical assessment at the very end of their lease term.
That creates the before and after picture.
This creates a definitive, scientifically proven before and after snapshot of the environmental health of the land, forcing the tenant to definitively prove they didn't contaminate the site during their years of occupancy.
That is such a brilliant, airtight defensive strategy. Okay, we have reached the final major segment of our deep dive, behind the curtain math, managers, and money. We are going to look at the secret formulas and the operational realities of commercial real estate. I want to start with a mathematical concept that is a very rude awakening for many first-time commercial office tenants. It is called the RU factor, the rentable versus usable area multiplier. This is the secret math that dictates what you actually pay for, and it often feels like legalized robbery to a new business owner.
The RU factor is arguably the single most important mathematical concept to grasp in commercial office leasing, because it directly inflates your primary overhead cost. To understand it, we must define the spatial terminology.
Let's lay out the terms.
The gross building area is the absolute total floor area of the structure, based on measuring the exterior walls. The gross leasable area is the total interior space designated for the exclusive revenue-generating use of the tenants. But the financial conflict arises from the distinction between usable area and rentable area.
Right.
Usable area is exactly what it sounds like. It is the actual physical space you exclusively occupy. It is the square footage literally contained within the interior walls of your specific office suite.
Right, it's the space where I actually place my reception desk, my employees' cubicles, and my computers. It's the space I actually use.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here's the critical catch. In commercial real estate, you do not pay rent based solely on your usable area. Your lease dictates that you pay based on your rentable area. Rentable area equals your usable area, PLUS, your mathematically proportionate share of all the building's common areas.
Ah, the common areas.
You are legally required to pay rent for a calculated percentage of the grand main lobby, the public washrooms down the hall, the janitorial supply closets, the electrical rooms, and the shared elevator lobbies. The mathematical relationship between the space you actually use and the space you are billed for is called the RU factor, also known in some markets as the loss factor.
Let's use some clean, intuitive numbers to show exactly how this mathematical formula magically inflates a tenant's rent bill. Imagine a boutique commercial office building.
Yeah.
The total rentable area of the entire building is 10,000 square feet. But if you measure only the actual office suites inside the usable area, it only totals 8,500 square feet.
Okay, so there's a difference.
The missing 1,500 square feet represents the shared lobby and the public bathrooms. To calculate the RU factor, the landlord divides the total rentable area by the total usable area. So 10,000 divided by 8,500 gives us an RU factor of roughly 1.142, or let's say 1.14. Wait, the outline says 1.142857 for the big example.
Let's use the big example from the text. It's clearer.
You're right. Let's look at the specific one from the source material.
Mhm.
A 120,000 square foot building with 105,000 square feet of usable area has an RU factor of 1.142857.
Right. Now let's apply that exact multiplier to a specific real-world lease negotiation. Suppose you find a beautiful office suite in that building. You bring in your architect, you measure the space precisely inside your walls, and it is exactly 3,680 square feet of usable area.
3,680.
You negotiate a rental rate based on that, assuming you know your costs. But to calculate what you will actually be billed for on your monthly invoice, the lease mandates that you multiply your 3,680 square feet of usable area by that 1.142857 RU factor. So 3,680 multiplied by 1.142857 equals 4,206 square feet.
That is the gut punch. You are physically operating your business within 3,680 square feet, but your legal contract forces you to pay rent as if you occupied 4,206 square feet. You are paying thousands of dollars every single year for over 500 square feet of phantom space that exists out in a lobby that your employees walk through for 10 seconds a day.
It's an absolutely brilliant financial system designed by landlords.
It ensures that every single square inch of the building's footprint, even the janitor's closet, is heavily monetized and paid for by the tenants.
Which naturally leads us to the professionals who actually enforce these rules, collect these inflated rents, and manage the daily chaos of these massive, complex structures. The landlord and their delegated property manager. Ultimately, the landlord holds the core legal responsibilities. They must provide accurate representations of the property, ensure the core building structure complies with all municipal building codes during major renovations, and fundamentally, they must guarantee the tenant quiet possession.
Quiet possession.
Under the law, provided the tenant is diligently paying their rent and fulfilling their lease obligations, the landlord cannot cause any unwarranted interference that disrupts the tenant's ability to conduct their business operations.
And when it comes to the physical maintenance of a massive commercial property, the industry documentation makes a very sharp philosophical distinction between preventive maintenance and corrective maintenance. Corrective maintenance is purely reactive. It's scrambling to fix a shattered window, patching a leaking roof after a storm, or repairing a busted boiler in the dead of winter, putting out fires.
Right.
Preventive maintenance is proactive. It's scheduling routine, comprehensive inspections, and servicing of all mechanical systems to prevent that expensive deterioration and catastrophic failure from happening in the first place. In a sprawling commercial complex, a landlord achieves this proactive stabilization by delegating sweeping authority to a professional property manager.
The property manager is the operational linchpin of the asset. They handle the relentless day-to-day friction of the building. They field tenant complaints, aggressively pursue rent collection, manage the operating accounts, pay the municipal taxes, and handle all the complex financial accounting.
They're doing everything.
They're the ones negotiating contracts and hiring the security personnel, the janitorial staff, and the specialized third-party contractors required for heavy repairs. But perhaps their most critical life-saving responsibility is the creation and maintenance of the property's emergency procedure manual. They must develop, document, and draw highly coordinated response plans for every conceivable disaster. Structural fires, chemical explosions, bomb threats, vandalism, sudden environmental contamination, armed robbery, and massive prolonged power failures. They're responsible for the physical safety of thousands of occupants.
Now, let's take a quick look behind the financial curtain at the professionals who actually put these massive, multi-million-dollar commercial transactions together. How do the real estate agents actually get paid? The documentation details the complex commission calculations under the regulatory provisions, and it varies wildly depending on the specific asset class being leased. For a standard office lease, the commission structure is usually quite straightforward. The agent is paid a fixed, negotiated price per square foot per year of the lease term, largely regardless of the final actual rental rate negotiated between the landlord and tenant.
But when you transition to massive industrial or complex retail leases, the commission calculation formula changes entirely. In those sectors, the commission is almost always calculated as a percentage of the total net rent generated over the entire lifespan of the lease term.
Or the whole term.
And interestingly, it is frequently structured on a sliding regressive scale. The percentage the agent earns actually decreases as the duration of the lease extends. For a hypothetical example, the leasing agent might negotiate to receive 5% of the net rent generated in the first year of the lease, 4% of the rent generated in the second year, and only 3% of the rent generated in years 3, 4, and 5 of a long-term agreement.
And there is a vital foundational legal distinction that the real estate professional must maintain during their rigorous due diligence process to legally earn that substantial commission. They must clearly understand and navigate the severe legal difference between representing a client versus dealing with a customer.
This is a cornerstone concept in real estate agency law. A client is a party, whether a landlord, tenant, buyer, or seller, who has entered into a formal, legally binding representation agreement with the real estate brokerage. By signing that agreement, the brokerage assumes a strict fiduciary duty to that client.
Fiduciary duty.
They are legally mandated to fiercely protect and aggressively promote the best financial and strategic interests of the client above all else, including their own desire for a commission. A customer, on the other hand, is a party who has specifically declined a representation and has only signed a limited customer service agreement. The services provided to a customer are highly restricted. The real estate professional must treat the customer fairly, honestly, and with integrity, but they absolutely do not owe them any fiduciary duties of loyalty or strategic confidentiality.
However, there is a massive legal catch regarding transparency. Regardless of whether the agent is dealing with their fiercely protected client or an unrepresented customer, the real estate professional is legally obligated to disclose all known material facts. A material fact is any piece of information that is significant enough that it could reasonably alter a person's decision to enter into the contract. For their client, the agent must take proactive, exhaustive steps to investigate, discover, and disclose any hidden facts that would impact the client's strategic decision. But even when dealing with a customer to whom they owe no loyalty, the agent must still openly disclose any material facts that are known or crucially ought to be known by a competent professional.
That phrase is key. Ought to be known.
If the agent knows the commercial roof requires a $100,000 replacement, they cannot legally hide that devastating fact simply because the prospective buyer is only a customer.
That stringent regulatory requirement for disclosure is exactly what drives the intense, exhaustive verification process we've been discussing this entire time. It is why the professional must painstakingly verify the municipal zoning to ensure it permits heavy industrial use. It is why they must forensically verify a retail tenant's past business history and health permit requirements, and is why they must rigorously review every lease in a multi-tenant plaza to confirm there are no hidden exclusive use restrictions that would accidentally place a new tenant in a space where they are legally barred from operating their business. The liability for getting it wrong is immense.
So, what does this all mean? We have journeyed through an incredibly dense landscape today, covering everything from the terrifying liability of buried, resting oil tanks to the complex mathematical formulas of RU multipliers that quietly inflate your rent.
It's a lot to process.
To summarize our deep dive into these materials, whether you are a hopeful entrepreneur signing your very first lease for a tiny boutique, or a seasoned logistics executive purchasing a 1,000,000-square-foot industrial facility, you have to understand that you are never just buying or renting empty physical space. You are actively buying into an incredibly intricate, unforgiving web of legal propriety, massive environmental liabilities, hidden mathematical formulas, and critical mechanical dependencies that will ultimately dictate the financial success or catastrophic failure of your business. The commercial real estate market is a high-stakes, uncompromising arena where ignorance of the rules isn't just an excuse. It is a guarantee of financial disaster.
And as we wrap up this extensive analysis, I want to leave you with a final, broader thought to mull over. We've spent this entire time down in the granular details of lease clauses and liability frameworks, but I encourage you to consider how these invisible financial and legal structures, specifically the aggressive risk allocation of the triple net lease and the revenue-sharing partnership of the percentage lease, secretly dictate the physical, visual, and architectural layout of the very city you live in.
Wow, yeah.
The reason your favorite local independent coffee shop might be squeezed into a tiny, narrow, unassuming bay, while a massive, seemingly empty national department store anchors the absolute best, most prominent location in the mall, isn't simply a matter of architectural design or aesthetic preference. It is the direct physical manifestation of risk allocation, base rent calculations, and exclusive use clauses that were fiercely negotiated by teams of lawyers in a boardroom years before you ever walk through those glass doors. The economy shapes the architecture.
That is such a profound way to look at the built environment around us. The next time you walk into a massive retail store, don't just look at the merchandise. Look up at the immense clear height of the ceiling. Notice the vast shared lobby that someone is paying rent for. Look for the strategic placement of a heavy-duty loading dock out back, and realize that you are physically walking inside the parameters of a living, breathing, fiercely negotiated legal contract. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep looking deeper into the spaces you occupy every single day. Until next time.